Albert Camus is known as an existentialist. At the outset, it should be established that the author rejected that label. The Stranger was first published in 1942, and volumes of analysis have tried to find meaning in the book and in the narrator's perceived apathy. But is it apathy we see in the novel's first-person narrator, Meursault? One might contend that labels and schools of literary theory can limit a reader's understanding of a novel by projecting an author's words through a politicized lens. Furthermore, Camus would have rejected any political lens. Readers bring their own complex interests, prejudices, and ideas to a text, and any meaning derived from a novel begins and ends there. Should a reader approach these texts with preconceived notions? Clent Brooks, a formalist, believed that critics should be concerned primarily with the work itself. Perhaps it is best that a reader understands Camus through his choices as a writer. We must see the first-person narrator in The Stranger, Meursault, as reliable, and the clarity required for an accurate reading abides in that narration, in Camus' carefully chosen words. Camus, like many modern writers, seeks a way to make peace with a chaotic world, to understand his place in it. Camus' father was killed in World War I. How is one to absorb or comprehend such a loss or the violence of war? Meursault's search is timeless then, a question of how one might perceive and endure life's highs and lows, and those questions are larger than historical context. Moreover, Camus was inclined to look to the ancient Greeks for ideas, and he had no patience for modern political philosophies. The one conclusion that might be drawn from the text is that Meursault's seemingly absurd acceptance of his fate is not out of the ordinary for Camus, not puzzling at all, since it is seated in this rejection of systems. It is Meursault's victory to rise above the false hope that lives within those systems, and we might not characterize any of his reactions throughout the book as apathetic or disconnected. Meursault is, in fact, intensely connected to his world, which we shall see. The Stranger was published in 1942. The French title, L'Étranger, has often been translated as The Outsider. As critics and theorists read between the lines to find meaning in The Stranger, they build barriers to the text, and those barriers might include the label of existentialism. Camus rejected easy or facile solutions. Each critical approach and each effort at labeling and defining the stranger, the definitions that critics and students of Camus know so well, leave the novel bound by tradition, prejudices, and previous criticism. The Stranger becomes simple when literary criticism and political lenses are stripped away. Symbolism holds no weight in The Stranger either. Those interpretations that look for implications in the text are flawed. There are symbols everywhere if we look for them, but sometimes the Algerian sun is just the sun. Camus' message is present from the first pages of the novel. There is no stinging revelation that comes after Meursault shoots the Arab, nor after his arrest. In other works of literature, a murder or one's impending execution would be transformative moments. In The Stranger, they are only part of a pattern, a theme that exists in the novel from the very first sentence. Even as Meursault participates in the drama of the book, he is a faithful narrator. Meursault isn't hiding anything. Fiction writers often take great pains in deciding when a thing will be revealed for dramatic effect, but this is not the case with The Stranger. There is no possibility for a different account or alternate telling, no great surprise for the prosecutor to reveal, for example. Camus' protagonist has stayed on point, and his perceptions are believable. On page 41, Meursault's boss suggests the possibility of a transfer to Paris, where there are job openings. For Meursault, this type of move has no bearing on his life. Really, it was all the same to me, he says. This change should be appealing to one so young. This is Paris, after all. But Meursault says that he couldn't see any reason to change his life. One life is as good as another. Near the end of the book, Camus is sure to echo this statement, to hearken back to what Meursault has known for a long time. I had been right. I was still right. I was always right. I had lived my life one way, and I could just as well have lived it another. Camus himself wrote about The Stranger and tried to explain his aims for the novel to rescue it from literary criticism. Camus was young when The Stranger was published. He wrote the book in his late 20s, but he was capable of communicating complex feelings. Any moral complexity in The Stranger comes from the critics then, not from the text itself. Meursault has good intentions but confronts an insensitive and even hostile world. Youthful readers' reactions to the books are more accurate than academic assessments precisely because those young readers trust the text. As an art critic might back up from a painting to get a wider view and discern meaning, the literary critic reads a narrative, backs away from the words and sentences he has just read, and infers a pattern that allows him finally to see what the writer means. Northrop Frye calls this a representational fallacy. But still, we cannot deny that a writer begins with some thematic concern. Conversely, a certain theme might exist in the text. If an author tries to answer some larger question about his own life or larger issues related to mankind, then yes, that search can be discerned within a given text and without historical context. If the text contains philosophical notions, they will show themselves. But we cannot insert notions based on our own biases. If Camus offers any historical context, or if we are to speak of his thematic concerns with The Stranger, those questions, or the possible answers, seem to lie with the ancient Greeks. Historical context, in the modern sense, might not matter when we read The Stranger. Camus' collection of essays, The Myth of Sisyphus, was published in 1942. Camus works hard to define his own philosophy, and he uses the consideration of suicide as a starting place in the essay that gives the book its title. His conclusions are not simple, but they are abundantly clear when he seems to find joy in the never-ending drudgery that is Sisyphus' life. Camus lends credence to the idea that hope, the kind proffered by political leaders and organized religion, is anathema to him and conversely to Meursault. All Sisyphus' silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. In an essay called Helen's Exile, Camus goes to great lengths to distance himself from modern philosophy and the very concept of history. He is aware of the horrors the 20th century has wrought, aware of Hitler and the collapse of Europe after 1939, and aware of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Literature and history have ignored the beauty that existed before the modern city, he complains, and the beauty that exists above it. Political systems and organized religion cause only violent clashes, and these clashes have intensified in the 20th century. Values and how men interpret them have been misused to guide mankind, and the evidence is in front of us in the horror and tragedy of war. The modern thinkers who call themselves sons of Greece have flipped Greek thought on its end, and Camus believes that they get it wrong. For the Greeks, values pre-existed all action. Modern philosophy places its values at the end of action. Perhaps Greece is Camus' true spiritual motherland. His connection with the Greeks would lead him to the idea of revolt, and this revolt is against the idea of hope, perhaps because hope lends a falseness to any implied happiness. Thus, we have Camus' rejection of systems, including organized religion and Christianity. We might surmise that hope would rob Sisyphus of any joy, and Camus speaks to this idea at the end of The Stranger after Meursault yells at the chaplain about all the things he sees and believes about life and death. Camus writes, "As if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time, in that night alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world." This passage is carefully constructed, and it is no accident, then, that Meursault accepts his fate in a state of cleanliness. No accident that the world's indifference is gentle rather than brutal or unfeeling. Camus is trying to affirm the human order, and he makes a case for a brand of optimism in the stranger. That optimism will not come from religion or modern nihilism. Camus writes in Les Remarques sur la Révolte, "It is the solidarity of men in the same adventure, the fact that both he and the grocer are baffled." We all have a common fate, and we must accept it. In the same way that Nietzsche acknowledged where man would be without God, Camus sees man as an exile in a world where everything is given and nothing is explained. There is nothing coherent about existence, and the answers must lie in personal dignity, where we find some satisfaction in simply contemplating this absurdity. Camus relied on classicism to look beyond modern philosophical systems like fascism and Marxism. The things the Greeks stood for are valuable and alive with tragic freedom, human dignity, rational lucidity, and beauty. Camus saw Marxism as another religion, a deadly system that was far removed from the Greeks. If the universe is absurd, absurdity does not lead to despair. This begins to speak to Camus' aim with the stranger. Life must be seen wholly, with the eyes of tragic vision. Some writers have suggested that Meursault is portrayed as being lost in administrative apparatus and that his lack of power is the point of the book. If society is hostile, Camus had to see Meursault as innocent. But Camus never portrays Meursault as a victim of anyone or anything, even as he questions the idea that he is perhaps guilty of murder simply because he did not mourn his mother's death. With the murder and his curious attitude toward Mammon's death, he has stepped outside of society's norms. It is that step that makes him guilty. The entire point is freedom, though, the freedom of choosing one's reactions with dignity and lucidity. It is reasonable, then, to consider the vivid descriptions in the first half of The Stranger. Camus focuses on what looks like minutiae. From a craft perspective, where an author's purpose involves showing the reader necessary information that is vital to the plot or to revealing character, one might wonder about the nurse on page 17, for example. The caretaker tells Meursault that she has an abscess. "I didn't understand," Camus writes, "so I looked over at the nurse and saw that she had a bandage wrapped around her head just below the eyes." The same might be said for the description of his mother's friends sitting at the coffin with him. Why does the reader need to see this scene? This sort of detailed observation happens again and again, but the observations might not have any bearing on the plot. They hardly reveal anything about Meursault. Why does Camus write as if the reader might care or need to know about this nurse or the old man at his mother's coffin? Sartre and Blanchot contend that Meursault lives only through sensations, and that this stylistic choice allows Camus to avoid messy emotional content. There is something deeper in Meursault's observations. Meursault gives equal attention and equal emotional weight to everything. The nurse's bandage is just as important as his mother's death, and just as important as his avowed disbelief in God. Camus seems to provoke the reader with trivial information, a cigarette, a skylight, the hue of the sky, the old people sucking at the insides of their cheeks. So we understand Meursault's reactions after his arrest, or his seeming offhandedness concerning Marie and marriage. It is necessary for the reader to notice these unremarkable things because Meursault does. The reader sees what Meursault is conscious of at any given moment. Meursault perceives each of these things without judgment or feeling. Some things are pleasant or unpleasant, but most of his judgments do not move beyond that distinction. On a boring Sunday, he notes the people he sees from his balcony. The young men among them were gesturing more excitedly than usual, and I thought they must have seen an adventure film. Each of these observations is a building block. Neither Camus nor Meursault can be seen as nihilists, nor can we call Meursault apathetic or disconnected. If Camus has faith in anything, it is in the idea of mankind's ability to maintain a type of order. He urges a certain type of rebellion in The Rebel, but he eschews the godless answers in metaphysical rebellion, the surrealists, Stirner, Nietzsche, and the tradition of historical rebellion, the force of Marx, Lenin, and Hitler. A large part of this rebellion is awareness, being alive in a very vivid way and noticing everything. There is nothing abstract or arbitrary about Camus' rejection of Marxism and fascism. In The Rebel, he goes to great lengths to destroy and belittle both Hitler and Marx. Of Marx and socialism, he writes that it is not astonishing that he could blend in his doctrine, the most valid critical method, with a utopian messianism of highly dubious value. Marx is characterized as being separate from facts. Further, the Christian and Marxist worlds are unified in a way that separates them from the Greeks. For the Greeks, the history of the world was cyclical, but the Christians introduced two ideas that are antithetical to that cycle: history and punishment. Marxism is distinct from Christianity because of its strict atheism, but for Camus, socialism deifies man and creates the same problems. It assumed some of the characteristics of traditional religion. Camus writes that most novels are an exercise in nihilism and connected to the systems he rejects. The proper rebellion or revolution is against the powers of death and oblivion. If the writer rejects death and oblivion, the way he treats reality speaks to the intensity of this rejection. There is an intensity to Meursault's observations then. The cigarette and the skylight matter, but no work of art can completely reject reality. Sartre, perhaps mistakenly, said that Camus' hero was unsatisfactory because he did not possess the hidden gnawing which is due to the blinding presence of death. We might see this as incorrect, though. Meursault does not find death to be blinding. He rejects the idea that he is defeated by it. If Meursault becomes a sort of Christ figure in defeating death, it is not because of Christian ideas. If some secular alternative to God exists, Camus never stopped searching for it, never stopped refining it. He was aware of Nietzsche's warnings that the absence of God would lead to other types of worship, the very specific dangers of ideologies like Marxism and Nazism. But the universe cannot provide order, though our very consciousness, the human condition, seems to demand it. Camus works the same territory as Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky, skeptical of Enlightenment thinkers and rationalism. Progress for man is not providential. He must figure out this life for himself, how to live properly without God. If we are to connect Camus to the idea of existentialism, then the focus might be on where he and Sartre diverge. These same ideas are important to what we see in The Stranger. Sartre, in denying the existence of God, also denies innate morality, and he sees this as the ultimate dilemma. That is the very start of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist. Man is forlorn because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. Sartre was also a committed Marxist, and this would be a large part of what separated these men who were once friends. There can be no doubt as to Camus' displeasure with Marx and Marxism. One can hardly miss the point either of what seems to be Sartre's blind acceptance of a political philosophy. As noted earlier, Camus dismissed Marx in severe terms. Marxism and socialism offered the flawed hope of some brighter utopian tomorrow, and this is where existentialism fails, in its acceptance of a system that offers some outward solution. But more important, Camus refuses to see man as forlorn or without a sense of morality. Marxism is another form of escape, a religion. We can live without religion, without some form of escape, without something that exists in an abstract later. Escapism, as offered by religion and ideologies, is the ultimate irrationality for Camus. This is where the absurd clashes with existentialism. Camus, again, looks to the Greeks. We note our limits in a reasonable way, in a lucid way, and therein lies our power. A proper revolt will ignore the limits of human life, including mortality. This is where we might see a larger metaphor in The Stranger. Camus needed some way to show the pain involved in following a false master who offers a better tomorrow, that deification of what crushes them. Adherence to a system might just mean misery for all, both master and servant. One might suggest that this metaphor lives in Chapter 2 in the passages about Meursault's apartment building. Meursault has just eaten lunch with the dispatcher from his office, and he walks home keenly aware of his surroundings, glad to be walking near the docks. The sky was green. I felt good, Camus writes. But as he walks upstairs, Meursault's neighbor Salamano is there with his dog. The dog has mange and is covered in sores. On the first reading, this might be another case where a reader wonders at Camus' reasoning or method. Why do we see the dog or Salamano? And what bearing does this ugly relationship have on the arc of the story? There are striking sentences here that speak to something larger, though, and they certainly fall in line with what Camus wrote in The Rebel. Like the dog, Salamano has scabs on his face and his hair is thinning. He is unhealthy, angry, and stuck with the dog, attached to an idea that he must care for the dog. The relationship is tortured and unbearable, and the two have been inseparable for 8 years. What have they gained in these 8 years? Camus writes, they look as if they belong to the same species, and yet they hate each other. The same thing happens in the scene that follows. Raymond expects the system of the underworld to help solve his problems with a girl, but he is not served by this system. He looks to Meursault for advice and help. They are both men, after all, and Raymond decides that they are pals. And why not? The end of Chapter 3 is striking in this regard, and Camus allows the reader to see that none of these events are disconnected. Meursault connects them when he realizes that Raymond knows about Mammon's death. Raymond gave me a very firm handshake and said that men always understand each other, Camus writes. Meursault needs to pause and absorb it all then in the dark stairwell. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. I stood there motionless, and in old Salamano's room, the dog whimpered softly. The reader can feel something profound in Meursault's quiet reflection. If Meursault has a hyper-awareness of the things around him, if he is lucid and awake, he gives equal weight to each of them in a couple of short paragraphs. Camus purposely conflates the idea of men understanding one another, Meursault and Raymond, with Salamano's whimpering dog, which can be heard from the hallway, and with Raymond's acknowledgement of his mother's death. Perhaps that is because the story will move quickly when Chapter 4 begins. Meursault's perceptions will move at a faster pace, and so will events. What we might suggest, though, is that Meursault's consideration of these events, the way he sees the world, will not be changed. It is also important that he is not judging Salamano or Raymond. He is alive, though, and he must stop to appreciate the fact that he has a pulse and that he can hear the blood in his veins. Chapter 4 seems to be overflowing with events, then. Meursault making love with Marie, the fight in Raymond's room, and the police arriving at the apartment building. If Raymond's character is dubious, Meursault does not find it necessary to judge him, and the two go out after the police are gone. Here we note again that Meursault will voice displeasure at certain things, and sometimes without reasons. He refuses to go to a whorehouse with Raymond because he says, "I don't like that." In the same paragraph, he characterizes a moment with Raymond in the same seemingly offhanded way. "I found him very friendly with me, and I thought it was a nice moment." These passages exemplify and sustain the idea that Meursault perceives everything equally, and that he refuses to offer any emotional weight to those things he finds nice or to those things he dislikes. Raymond's character or integrity does not matter to Meursault. Perret places this in the context of Camus' views on Christianity. He is opposed to notions like incarnation, grace, redemption, repentance, collective guilt. All that happens here in this world and the afterlife is another false hope, so the notion of sin is also meaningless to Camus. Raymond's integrity or lack of it is just another notion to consider. We can see then that Meursault would not consider Raymond as sinful. Raymond has simply made a choice about how to live. It is significant, too, that Camus returns to Salamano and the dog in Chapter 4, and this further emphasizes the point that the episode is not a random one. Salamano is characterized as flustered, and he tells Meursault that the dog got away from him at the parade ground. The man's eyes are red, and he snaps at Meursault. He says, "I never thought the bastard would take off like that." Salamano is conflicted, angry, and attached to the dog all at once. He insists that he would never pay for the dog's return. He would rather let him die, and yet continues to question Meursault and Raymond about the possibility of retrieving the animal from the police. We might pinpoint the issue of control in the Salamano episode, control that is sought by the dog-like citizens who live and suffer within a government bureaucracy and yet still expect that bureaucracy to exist. The desire for control lives in the masters of that bureaucracy, but there is always trouble, or as Camus would characterize it, nihilistic rebellion. For Camus, the system has a negative effect on anyone who relies on it, anyone who looks to it for hope. We might equate this with the dichotomy between perceived freedom and a government that controls every aspect of life. Salamano and the dog personify this idea. Still, the book is not weighed down with metaphors. There are other curious passages, though, and one of the most curious comes in the paragraphs before Meursault shoots the Arab. Perhaps in this case we cannot call it metaphor. Camus' hero is back on the beach, and the sun is oppressive. It burns him, and he's sweating. My forehead especially was hurting me, all the veins in it throbbing under the skin. Again, Camus conflates incidents in this passage. Mammon's funeral is there in the protagonist's thoughts, this day on the beach, and the idea of Meursault's attentiveness to his own body, which harkens back to the end of Chapter 3. The veins throbbing in Meursault's forehead echo the quiet moments in the stairwell when his blood is pulsing. As always, Meursault is hyper-aware and his observations are vivid or lucid. But here in Chapter 6, we see Camus veer into figurative language for the first time. And perhaps that is because the reader must know Meursault's observations in an equally vivid way. How does one describe sunlight glinting off a knife or the same light reflecting off the ocean's water? These are flashes that go by in an instant. Camus is almost an impressionist then, and he paints a picture. Before Meursault's most violent moment, he uses language that makes the environment violent too, a stark juxtaposition to the real violence that approaches. He writes, "The light shot off the steel, and it was like a long flashing blade cutting at my forehead. The scorching blade slashed at my eyelashes and stabbed at my stinging eyes." Why should Camus describe Meursault's surroundings with such vivid verbs? Before he pulls the trigger, Meursault characterizes the sea as having fiery breath. Perhaps it is because of the equal value he offers to every perception. And when the trigger gives, the murder is described in terms that are far less violent than the words that show sunshine reflecting from the knife. Meursault fires the weapon, and yet he seems to be referring only to sound when he says, "I knew that I had shattered the harmony of the day, the exceptional silence of a beach where I'd been happy." This shattered harmony is not spiritual. Any harmony that day exists in the quiet, and whether the Arab is dead seems to be an afterthought. When Meursault shoots 4 more times, we can almost conclude that the effort is only an attempt to hear the sharp and deafening noise. The Arab's body is motionless, but the shooter's attention is turned to the sound of the revolver and the smoothness of the metal, not the condition of his victim. The moment leading up to the murder is described in violent terms, but Camus purposely stays away from portraying the shooting in a way that looks violent. If the author was intent on painting a scene in vivid terms, he has abandoned that idea when the shooting occurs. So how are we finally to assess the work of Albert Camus? Certainly his work takes on a specific form, and it is shaped by Camus' power to think, and a theme runs through all his work. Camus was of his time, and he was born in an age when swift changes had transformed life from an agrarian setting to one that was urban and industrial. Moreover, the end of ruling families and feudal systems had drastically changed the face of Europe. We might surmise that the systems built to replace the royal families created the problems that Camus considers. He was aware of the Soviet purges, for example. Perhaps what is more important in this context is the technology that allowed for more violent wars and destruction at levels which man had never seen. World War I cast a pall over all of Europe, and that pall was personal for Camus. The world had taken a secular turn, and the influence of the church had been diminished. The Vatican's sway over political leaders was a thing of the past. Camus read Nietzsche as a young man, and he experienced loss at a personal level. His father died in 1914 in the Battle of Marne. Camus would never know him, so even as an infant, he was affected by the violence of World War I. If the world would be godless, as Nietzsche made clear, and if a man had to navigate a life that was chaotic and violent, how could one best live that life? What answers did religions offer, or Europe's revolutionary thinkers? In the end, Camus rejects modern political systems and organized religion. His disbelief in God is affirmed, but he will not call himself an atheist. If there is meaning in The Stranger, it does live in the text and in the final paragraphs of the book. Meursault's joyful acceptance of his death is seated in the tragic vision of the Greeks. For Camus, Meursault's fate is a rejection of systems and a rejection of false hope promised by the utopian visions of Marxists and the Christian promise of an afterlife. The meaning is in acceptance, and that acceptance is Camus' revolt. Meursault can be indifferent to his approaching death because he has accepted the dichotomies that are inherent to existence. One experience is not better or greater than another, as long as you live each one as a wide-awake being. Some insist on calling this an absurdity. For Meursault and Camus, the idea is not absurd. It is a vital discovery, one that gives life meaning. It is the striving that counts. Camus would approach the world with a kind of optimism and the idea that one could rise above nihilism. Men were capable of sharing struggles, even without a divine presence. The author's sharp intellect and his reliance on the ancient Greeks as a guide sets him apart from other authors of his time. The 20th century brought steep challenges to man's perception of the world around him, questions about time, fractured belief systems, and consciousness itself, which had been turned upside down by Freud. Many writers tried to tackle those questions, but their answers might not be as vivid as what we see in Camus' body of work. Camus' rejection of systems set him apart. We might credit Camus' intellect for the ongoing analysis of his work, for the constant effort at understanding his place in the world of literature. Perhaps it is easy enough to say that, as Scott characterizes him, Camus has lasted because he was a modest optimist, and his thinking is still relevant today. As Camus wrote at the end of The Rebel, "It is time to forsake our age and its adolescent furies. The bow bends, the wood complains. At the moment of supreme tension, there will leap into flight an unswerving arrow, a shaft that is inflexible and free."